In the remote Carpathian wilderness, a weary American backpacker named Eli Wade was about to turn back from an aimless trek through the mist-thick forest. A routine detour for shelter turned deadly when a strange, silent dog led him to a rusted, military hatch long forgotten by history. Eli Wade wasn't your typical disillusioned travel writer. For 7 years, he had been a war correspondent and deep investigative journalist, known for exposing a government cover-up that toppled Seattle's elite at the cost of his best friend's life and his own career. When the decaying bunker's lock gave way and Eli descended into its cold, humming corridors, he had no idea he was stepping into the remnants of a Cold War psychic warfare experiment. What he uncovered: classified tapes, preserved children, a girl's voice whispering his name decades before his birth, triggered a chain of revelations designed to fracture any mind that listened. What began as a misfit solo hike became a confrontation with a consciousness bred to weaponize memory, thought, and time itself. The Carpathian forest would never be the same after Eli Wade dared to open the final door. Before we jump back, and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Carpathian forest was denser than Eli had expected, thick and watchful in a way that American forests weren't. Even the light seemed different here, filtered through layers of ancient pine and oak until it reached the forest floor as something murky and uncertain. It matched his mood perfectly. Eli Wade adjusted his backpack straps and paused to check his compass. The path he'd been following had narrowed to almost nothing, no more than a suggestion between the trees. According to the sparse tourist information, this trail eventually connected to a larger one near an abandoned shepherd's hut. But the map was clearly outdated. Like everything else in post-communist Romania, accuracy was an afterthought. Perfect. Metaphor for journalism these days, he muttered to himself, water bottle halfway to his lips, following paths that lead nowhere based on outdated information. He allowed himself a thin smile at his own expense. 3 years ago, Eli wouldn't have recognized himself. The cynicism, the self-pity, the aimless wandering through Eastern Europe with no deadline, no editor, no purpose. Just another burnout hiding from his own name. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of impending rain. Eli checked his watch. Almost 6. He needed to make camp before dark. Finding a small clearing beneath a ridge that would offer some protection from the weather, he began unpacking his tent. That's when he first noticed the dog. It stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless and watchful. A medium-sized mutt with coarse gray-brown fur and alert ears. Thin but not starving, with intelligent eyes that followed Eli's movements with unsettling attention. "Hey there," Eli said, straightening. "You lost too?" The dog neither approached nor retreated, simply watching. Up here in the mountains, it was strange to see a stray. The nearest village was at least 15 kilometers back. "I don't have much food to share," Eli warned, but rummaged through his pack anyway, finding a piece of dried sausage. He tossed it halfway between them. The dog ignored the offering completely, its gaze never leaving Eli's face. "Suit yourself." Eli returned to setting up his tent, occasionally glancing toward the animal. It remained in the same spot, sentinel-like, until dusk began settling over the forest. Only when Eli crawled into his tent did the dog finally disappear into the underbrush. Sleep came uneasily. In his dreams, Eli was back in Seattle, sitting across from Marcus in that chain coffee shop. The smell of burnt espresso. Marcus sliding a thumb drive across the table. "This goes deeper than we thought, Eli. People at the top, but once it's out there and there's no taking it back." He woke with a start, his sleeping bag damp with sweat despite the mountain chill. Outside, something moved through the underbrush. Eli fumbled for his headlamp, clicking it on just in time to catch the reflection of eyes at the edge of his camp. The dog had returned. "Jesus," Eli exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" Morning brought no relief. When Eli emerged from his tent, the dog was sitting just beyond the clearing, watching him with the same unnerving focus. It followed at a distance as he broke camp and continued hiking, always keeping 30 feet between them. "Go home." Eli. finally shouted after an hour of this silent escort. He hurled a pine cone toward the animal, deliberately missing. "Go on!" The dog didn't flinch. By midday, the path had disappeared entirely. Eli consulted his compass, aiming to rejoin the main trail. The sky had darkened ominously, and the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains. "Great," he muttered. "Just perfect." The dog suddenly darted ahead, stopping to look back at Eli expectantly before continuing through a dense patch of undergrowth. It repeated this motion when Eli didn't immediately follow. "I'm not following." "You," Eli said aloud, aware of how ridiculous he sounded arguing with a stray dog in the Romanian wilderness. "I've got a route." The dog disappeared into the thicket. Moments later, the sky opened and rain began to pour through the canopy. Cursing, Eli ducked under a tree for minimal shelter and consulted his map. If he continued northwest, he should hit the main trail within 2 kilometers. A bark echoed from the direction the dog had gone, sharp, insistent. Then another. "Not interested in your guided tour," Eli called back. The dog emerged from the brush, soaking wet and somehow more determined. It barked again, then retreated, a few steps watching. "Fine," Eli snapped, surprising himself with the outburst. "Fine, lead on, lassie." Following the animal meant pushing through overgrown terrain Eli would normally have avoided. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure he was still following. After 20 minutes of this, the rain slackening to a drizzle, Eli noticed the forest had changed. The trees were more widely spaced here, unnaturally, so, as if they'd been planted, or as if something had once stood in their place. "What is this?" Eli whispered, more to himself than the dog. His foot caught on something solid. Looking down, Eli saw a rusted length of chain-link fencing almost entirely reclaimed by the forest floor. Nearby, a fallen concrete post lay half-buried, in moss and ferns. Eli's journalistic instincts, dormant for so long, sparked to life. He followed the line of the former fence until he found a signpost. The metal was corroded, but portions of the text remained legible, blocky Cyrillic letters, and underneath, in Romanian, restricționat, acces militar numai, restricted, military access only. "Cold War relic," Eli murmured, running his fingers over the weathered text. But this far into the mountains? What would have been worth guarding out here? The dog watched him from several yards away, its fur beginning to dry into ragged tufts. For the first time, Eli noticed a patch of white on its chest, roughly in the shape of a crescent moon. "What did you bring me to, boy?" In answer, the dog trotted deeper into the unnatural clearing. Eli followed, his curiosity fully awakened now. The ground sloped gradually downward, forming a shallow depression that might once have been deliberate landscaping, now soft with decades of fallen leaves and needle cover. A distant howl pierced the afternoon quiet. Not the dog in front of him, but something farther off. The sound was answered by another, then another, forming an eerie chorus that echoed through the mountains. The dog, his dog, stopped suddenly, ears pricked toward the howling. A low growl rumbled in its throat. It turned to Eli and barked sharply before pacing in a tight circle over a particular spot. "What is it? What's there?" Eli approached cautiously. The dog moved aside as he knelt to examine the ground. Brushing away layers of decomposing vegetation, his fingers struck something solid and flat. Digging more eagerly now, Eli uncovered the edge of what appeared to be a concrete slab. Further clearing revealed a rusted metal hatch set into the slab, its surface crusted with lichen and dirt. Military bunker, Eli thought immediately, not uncommon in former Soviet-influenced territories. But something about this felt different, more deliberate in its isolation. Working his fingers under the edge of the hatch Eli pulled, it didn't budge. He tried again, straining against decades of disuse until something inside gave way with a sound like breaking glass. The hatch lifted a few inches, releasing a gust of stale, cold air that carried a faint chemical smell. Eli's headlamp revealed only darkness below. His heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but with the familiar, almost forgotten thrill of discovery, of a story waiting to be uncovered. He hadn't felt this surge of purpose since before Seattle, before everything fell apart. This is crazy, he told himself, but he was already digging through his pack for a stronger flashlight. Behind him, the dog had gone completely still. It sat watching, neither encouraging nor warning, its strange vigil now complete. As Eli worked the hatch open wider, the animal's eyes reflected his flashlight beam. Two perfect circles of light in the gathering dusk. For the first time, Eli wondered if following this dog had been his choice at all. The metal ladder creaked beneath Eli's weight as he descended into darkness, each rung slick with condensation. His flashlight beam cut through the stale air, illuminating particles of dust suspended like microscopic planets in an airless void. 10 feet down, 15, 20, the shaft was deeper than he'd expected. This was definitely not on the tourist brochure, Eli muttered, his voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. At the bottom, his boots touched concrete. He swept his light across what appeared to be an antechamber. Bare walls, a single, metal door with faded Cyrillic stenciling. Above, framed in the open hatch, the dog's silhouette was visible against the evening sky. "Coming," Eli called up. The animal whined softly but made no move to follow. "Smart dog," Eli said, turning back to the door. The lock mechanism had long since corroded, and with some effort, he forced it open. The hinges screamed in protest, releasing another gust of that strange chemical-tinged air. Eli's phone buzzed in his pocket. No signal this far underground, just a notification that his device was automatically recording video, as he'd set it to do when he started his descent. Journalistic habits died hard. He clipped his phone to his shirt pocket, letting it capture whatever his flashlight revealed. Beyond the first door lay a corridor that stretched into darkness, branching in two directions. The walls were institutional green, now peeling and water-stained. Metal placards marked doorways on either side, their text faded but still legible in Romanian and Russian. Decontamination, observation, records. Eli chose the path leading to records, his flashlight playing over years of decay. The ceiling was low, claustrophobic with exposed pipes and electrical conduits. Something scurried away from the light. Rats, probably. At least something was alive down here. The records room was larger than he'd expected, lined with metal shelving units and filing cabinets. Most had been emptied, their contents either removed or scattered across the floor in yellowing piles. Water damage had destroyed much of what remained. But at the far end of the room, a section of shelving had been sealed in what looked like industrial-grade plastic sheeting, preserving its contents from the ambient moisture. Eli approached it carefully, his heartbeat quickening. Inside the plastic were stacked boxes of reel-to-reel tapes, filing folders, and what appeared to be research journals. All were meticulously labeled with dates ranging from 1979 to 1987. "Jackpot," he whispered. Through a doorway on the opposite side, Eli found what had once been a monitoring station. Banks of outdated equipment lined the walls, analog recording devices, playback stations, even an early computer terminal. Most were rusted or rotted beyond recognition, but one reel-to-reel player looked relatively intact, protected by a makeshift covering of the same plastic sheeting. Eli's hand hovered over the machine. He shouldn't touch anything. Not without proper documentation, not without understanding what this place was. The professional journalist in him knew this. But the burnout who'd wandered rootless for 3 years didn't care about protocols anymore. He returned to the records room, selected a tape labeled Induction 1 Subject VIs and brought it back to the player. After examining the machine's controls, he managed to thread the tape and, with a silent prayer to whatever gods protected reckless journalists, pressed play. A moment of static, then silence. Eli adjusted a dial, and suddenly, a young girl's voice filled the room. "Numele meu este Viorica Iancu. Am 12 ani." A pause, then in accented but clear English. "My name is Viorica Iancu. I am 12 years old." Eli's skin prickled. The voice was calm, emotionless, with a rehearsed quality that felt wrong coming from a child. I am recording this on July 8, 1983. If you are listening, you have found Project Ugra. I was brought here on March 22, 1981. I am Subject VI. There were 16 of us when the project began. A long pause, then. Now I am the only one who can still speak. Eli fumbled for his journal, scribbling notes as the voice continued. Colonel Solinari says I must leave these records, for science, for those who come after. But Dr. Brewer says no one should ever find this place. Another pause. I think both of them are right. The tape continued with clinical descriptions of conditioning protocols and influence radiuses that made little sense to Eli. The girl, Viorica, described experiments involving sensory deprivation, memory partition, and something called remote emotional infiltration. Her vocabulary was advanced for her age, alternating between childlike observations and jarringly sophisticated scientific terminology. Eli stopped the tape, his hands shaking slightly. What the hell had he stumbled into? Cold War experimentation wasn't unheard of, but this sounded like something from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. He needed to see more. The next room he explored had once been a dormitory of sorts. 6 narrow beds, now rotted to their metal frames, lined one wall. Children's drawings still clung to the concrete in places, crude figures holding hands beneath a red sun. Strange symbols that resembled electrical diagrams interspersed with normal childish sketches of houses and trees. But it was the adjacent room that stopped Eli cold. A wall of Polaroid photographs, protected behind glass in a sealed case. Hundreds of images of children, measuring height, weight, brain scans. Each photo was tagged with subject codes and dates. Most disturbing were the before-after pairs. The same child photographed before an experiment, eyes clear and present. Then, after, their gaze distant and unfocused. Eli's flashlight trembled as he scanned the images until he found her. Viorica Iancu. Subject VI. A thin girl with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to stare directly into the camera. Unlike the others, her after photos showed no change in expression. The same penetrating gaze, the same composed features. Beneath her photos, someone had written, "Successful adaptation." A doorway at the far end of the photo room led to a curving corridor that sloped gently downward. The air grew colder as Eli followed it, eventually reaching a heavy door marked "Cold Storage." He hesitated before this door longer than the others. Every instinct warned him against proceeding. But the journalist who had once exposed corruption in Seattle's highest offices, the journalist he'd thought long dead, drove him forward. The storage room was illuminated by the ghostly green glow of emergency lights that had somehow maintained power all these years. The walls were lined with what looked like oversized freezer units, their glass fronts fogged with condensation. Eli approached the nearest unit, wiping the glass with his sleeve. Inside, suspended in clear fluid, was a human body. A boy, no older than 14, perfectly preserved. A metal plate on the unit read, "Subject 8, terminated 04/16/1982, preservation protocol initiated for further study." Eli stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. His light swept across the room, revealing 5 more occupied units. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. A scratching sound from the corridor sent him spinning around. The dog, Shadow, as Eli had begun thinking of him, stood at the doorway, hackles raised. It was the first time the animal had followed him inside, but it clearly wouldn't enter this room. Instead, it growled, low and continuous, at something Eli couldn't see. "What is it, boy?" Eli's voice sounded strange in his own ears, too high, too tight. Shadow backed away, still growling, then turned and padded silently back up the corridor. Eli followed, not wanting to remain in the cold storage room any longer than necessary. He returned to the monitoring station, drawn back to Viorica's voice, the only human presence in this tomb of secrets. He started the tape again from where he'd left off. "They think I don't know what happened to the others," her young voice stated matter-of-factly. "But I see them in the cold room, I see them in my dreams. The Colonel calls it psychic bleed-through, memories that aren't mine. Dr. Brewer calls it guilt. A long pause filled only by the sound of breathing. If you are hearing this, you are already part of it. The experiment never ended. It was only dormant, waiting. The tape ended with a click. In the silence that followed, Eli became aware of another sound, a soft footfall, deeper in the bunker. Then another. He wasn't alone. Eli froze, flashlight beam fixed on the dark corridor ahead. The footsteps had stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. "Hello?" he called, immediately regretting it. His voice echoed through the concrete passages, broadcasting his position to whatever or whoever lurked in the darkness. No response came. After waiting a full minute in tense silence, Eli exhaled slowly. Probably just the building settling, he told himself. Or rats. Or his imagination, fueled by a girl's voice from 40 years ago. But deep down, he knew better. Shadow appeared at his side, seemingly materializing from the darkness. The dog nudged Eli's hand, then trotted toward another corridor he hadn't yet explored. This time, Eli followed without hesitation, grateful for the company. They descended, deeper into the complex, past rooms filled with rusted medical equipment and others that appeared to be primitive isolation chambers. Eventually, they reached a heavy door marked Archive, Archive. Unlike the other rooms, this one had been sealed with what looked like a more recent padlock. Eli examined it closely. The metal was tarnished, but not corroded like everything else. Someone had been here within the last decade. "Who else knows about this place, Shadow?" Eli murmured. He wedged his flashlight between his teeth and retrieved a multi-tool from his pack. After several minutes of picking and cursing, the lock clicked open. The archive room was smaller than he expected, but better preserved. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, and a central table held stacks of bound reports. Most striking was a wall safe, its door hanging open, recently emptied based on the dust patterns around it. Eli began systematically examining the remaining files. Many were in Russian or Romanian, but enough were in English or included translations that he could piece together the facility's purpose. His journalistic training kicked in, separating speculation from fact, building a timeline, identifying key figures. Hours passed as Eli filled page after page in his journal. Project Ugra, a joint operation between Romanian intelligence and NATO-affiliated scientists, officially off books. Its goal, developing psychic influencers, children trained to remotely affect the emotional states and decision-making processes of targets. The ultimate psychological warfare tool, invisible, deniable, unstoppable. The project's director, Colonel Andrei Solinari, had kept meticulous logs. A former Romanian intelligence officer who'd defected, he'd convinced certain NATO elements to fund his research in exchange for the results. His clinical descriptions of the experiments performed on children, most orphans or from Roma communities, that wouldn't be missed, turned Eli's stomach. Subject 8 exhibited prolonged resistance to emotional partitioning. Increasing dosage resulted in neural collapse. Subject terminated. Autopsy shows promising neural pathway development that will inform protocols for remaining subjects. And then repeatedly, Subject VI continues to show exceptional adaptation. Brewer believes her capacity for compartmentalization may be naturally occurring rather than induced. Recommend accelerated timeline for integration testing. On the central table, Eli found Dr. Isaac Brewer's research journals. The American neurologist had pioneered memory manipulation techniques, originally intended to help trauma victims. His early entries showed enthusiasm for the project's scientific possibilities. Later ones revealed growing ethical concerns. These children are not becoming less human through our procedures, I am. Somewhere during his reading, Eli realized he'd skipped lunch and dinner. His watch showed 2:17 a.m. He'd been underground for over 12 hours. Just a little longer, he told himself, unwrapping a protein bar from his pack. He needed to find more tapes, Needed to hear Viorica's voice again. Shadow had been pacing restlessly, occasionally stopping to stare at empty corners of the room. Now the dog suddenly froze, hackles raised, growling at the far wall where nothing but shadows existed. "What is it, boy?" The dog lunged, barking furiously at the empty air, snapping at nothing. Then, as abruptly as it had started, Shadow stopped, whimpering softly before retreating to Eli's side. A chill ran down Eli's spine that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. In a cabinet labeled audio documentation, Eli found another tape marked with Viorica's initials. VI, Progress Report 17. He quickly returned to the playback room and threaded it onto the machine. Test Protocol 17, Viorica's voice began, now sounding slightly older than on the first tape. Subject VI reporting self-assessment as instructed. A man's voice interrupted. Colonel Solinari, Eli presumed. Speak freely, Viorica. Tell us about the influence test. A pause, then. They brought in a rat in a cage. Dr. Brewer said to make it run counterclockwise for 20 seconds, then stop. I did this easily. And then? Solinari prompted. Then you said to make it hurt itself. To make it bite its own leg until it bled. Her voice remained eerily steady. I didn't want to, but I did it anyway. Why did you do it if you didn't want to? Because I knew if I didn't do it to the rat, you would do something worse to one of the others. To Mirella or Christian. It's always the same choice. Do the small cruelty to prevent the larger one. Very good, Viorica. You're learning to compartmentalize the emotional response from the necessary action. That will be all for today. The tape continued with the sound of a door closing. Then Viorica's voice returned, now whispering. They don't know I kept recording. Dr. Brewer's machine works too well. I can separate myself into pieces now, the piece that follows orders, the piece that watches, the piece that waits. The watching piece sees what they're really doing. We're not meant to influence rats. We're meant to influence people. Important people. Make them hurt themselves, maybe. Make them hurt others, definitely. Her voice grew even softer. I'm leaving this for whoever finds this place when it's all over. When we're all gone. Or maybe we'll never be gone. Maybe we'll still be here, just changed. The tape ended abruptly. Eli sat in silence, acutely aware of his own heartbeat, in his ears. The room seemed suddenly smaller, the air thicker. He needed to go back to the surface, to breathe, to process what he was learning. Yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. Instead, he grabbed his journal and began sketching connections between the fragments of information, working through the night. Sometime before dawn, he nodded off at the monitoring station. Dreams filled with children watching him through observation, glass. He woke with a start to a flickering light. Not his flashlight. The overhead fixtures were sputtering to life, casting the room in harsh fluorescent glare. Throughout the bunker, he could hear the hum of electrical systems activating, pumps cycling on, ventilation fans beginning to turn. Shadow was gone. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Disoriented and stiff, Eli made his way back to the main corridor. The emergency lighting system had fully engaged. Red guide lights along the floor, white overheads revealing the bunker in stark detail. The place looked different and proper. Light, less like a tomb, more like an abandoned research facility. Somehow this was more disturbing, not less. Eli followed the illuminated corridors until he reached a section he hadn't explored. A heavy blast door at the end of a reinforced hallway. Unlike the other doors, this one had power. A keypad glowed green beside it, and a small indicator. Light blinked steadily. Above the door in both English and Russian, a warning read, "Anomalous, do not open." As Eli approached, he heard a low, mechanical hum from the other side. Then, impossibly, the sound of a child's laughter, just a single echoing note that raised the hair on his arms. The control panel beside the door beeped once. The red security light changed to green. A hydraulic hiss escaped from the sealed edges as pressure equalized for the first time in decades. Eli stood transfixed as the massive door began to open on its own. The massive door opened with glacial slowness, releasing air that tasted metallic on Eli's tongue. He hesitated at the threshold, aware that each step deeper into the facility was taking him further from the person he'd been when he entered. The journalist in him demanded answers, but something more primal warned of dangers beyond understanding. Shadow reappeared at his side, tense and alert. Together they stepped through. The observation core was unlike anything Eli had seen in the facility so far. A perfect circle, perhaps 40 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling. The outer walls were lined with one-way mirrors, behind which would have been monitoring stations. At the center stood a single chair bolted to the floor, surrounded by a ring of what looked like modified EEG equipment. Cables snaked from the chair to various machines around the perimeter. "This is where they did it," Eli whispered. "Where they turned children into weapons." The room was eerily well preserved, as if sealed in a time capsule. Unlike the rest of the bunker, there was little decay here, only a fine layer of dust covering surfaces that otherwise appeared ready for use. Most unsettling was a child-sized hospital gown draped over the central chair, preserved in the dry, climate-controlled air. Eli approached one of the mirrored observation windows and wiped away decades of dust. Behind the glass was a control room filled with recording equipment and monitors. Through another window, he saw what appeared to be a small movie theater, presumably where observers would watch footage of the experiments. Moving methodically around the perimeter, Eli documented everything with his phone. In the projection room, he found stacks of film canisters and video reels labeled with subject codes and dates. Most were standard observations, but one section was marked Anka Infiltration Security Breach. Heart quickening, Eli selected one of these reels and located a projector. It took several minutes to figure out how to thread the ancient machine, but eventually the blank wall illuminated with grainy security footage. The timestamp read July 17, 1985. A teenage girl in a worker's uniform moved furtively through a corridor Eli recognized. She had the same dark hair and intense eyes as Viorica, but was older, perhaps 16 or 17. The girl paused at several doors, checking for surveillance, before accessing what appeared to be a file room. The footage jumped to another camera. Now the girl was confronting a startled guard, showing him something off camera. The guard's expression changed from suspicion to shock. He nodded and stepped aside, allowing her to pass. Another jump. The girl was now in a dormitory, the same one Eli had explored earlier. She moved to a bed where a younger girl lay sleeping. Viorica. The older girl shook her awake. Though there was no audio, Eli could see the urgency in her movements, the desperate pleading. Viorica sat up, confused. The older girl pulled her to her feet, thrust clothes into her arms. An escape attempt. The footage ended abruptly. Eli quickly loaded the next reel. This one showed security personnel rushing into the dormitory. The older girl, Anka, Eli presumed, standing protectively in front of Viorica. Guards restraining them both. Colonel Solinari entering, his face a mask of cold fury. He barked orders. The sisters were separated, dragged in opposite directions. The final reel was labeled Anka Terminated. Eli's hands trembled as he loaded it, expecting to witness an execution. Instead, the footage showed a different room, some kind of medical bay. Anka strapped to a table, struggling as Dr. Brewer prepared an injection. Close up on Brewer's face, mouth moving in what appeared to be an apology. The needle going in. Anka's body going slack. Then, nothing. The reel ended there. "They didn't kill her," Eli murmured. "At least not on camera." His gaze shifted to the cold storage room he'd discovered earlier. 5 bodies preserved there. None labeled as Anka. Shadow had been growing increasingly agitated, pacing the perimeter of the room, occasionally stopping to growl at one particular mirrored panel. When Eli approached it, he found a control panel hidden behind a sliding cover. A single button glowed faintly green. Against his better judgment, Eli pressed it. The mirrored panel slid aside, revealing a small alcove containing audio equipment and a single reel-to-reel tape labeled VI, Post Sister. With trembling hands, Eli removed the tape and returned to the room's central monitoring station. As he threaded it onto the player, his mind raced with questions. What had happened to Anka? Why was this tape hidden separately? Viorica's voice filled the room but changed. Harder, flatter, emptier than before. They took Anka 3 days ago. Dr. Brewer says he tried to help her escape. That she found him first, showed him documents about what they were doing to us. He says he tried to help us both. A long pause, punctuated by soft breathing. But when it failed, he had to take her memories. All of them. He says it's better than what the Colonel wanted. Says she's alive somewhere with a new name, new memories, new life. That she'll never remember me. Another pause. I don't believe him. Static filled the tape for several seconds before Viorica spoke again. Her voice had changed once more, now oddly disconnected, as if speaking from a great distance. I'm recording this for whoever finds this place after it's all over, after they're all gone. You need to understand what happens when you look too deeply into the dark, when you open doors that should stay closed. She laughed quietly, the sound echoing in the circular room. Reality isn't what you think. Memory isn't what you trust. They learned to break down the walls between minds, between past and present, between what was and what could be. I was their best subject because I could fragment myself, send pieces of my consciousness outward while keeping my core self intact. Shadow began barking frantically at the central chair, lunging toward it, before backing away as if repelled by an invisible force. I can feel you listening, Viorica's voice whispered, impossibly intimate. Right now, across time, you're there, in the core, playing my tape. I knew someone would come. I've been waiting. Eli froze, ice flooding his veins. The tape had been recorded decades ago. It was impossible for her to know. Don't be afraid, Eli Wade. His name. His fucking name. Yes, I know who you are. The girl's voice continued as if responding to his thought. The man who exposed the truth in Seattle. The man whose story destroyed lives. The journalist who couldn't live with the consequences of his revelations. Eli stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. This couldn't be happening. On one of the monitors that had flickered to life, surveillance footage began playing. It showed Viorica, perhaps 13 now, sitting in the central chair, electrodes attached to her temples. She stared directly into the camera and whispered, Eli Wade, then smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent shivers down his spine. The timestamp read May 12, 1984. 35 years before Eli was born. He played the tape again and again, his sense of reality fracturing with each repetition. Time seemed to stretch and compress. Had he been in the bunker for hours or days? Why had Shadow led him here? How could Viorica have known his name decades before his birth? As if in response to his spiraling thoughts, a section of the floor, near the central chair, slid open, revealing a staircase descending deeper still. Faint light emanated from below. There are more tapes down there, Viorica's voice said from the machine, though the tape had stopped playing. More answers, more questions. Will you go deeper, Eli Wade? Will you find what's left of me? Shadow stood at the top of the stairs, looking back at Eli expectantly. This isn't real, Eli said aloud. This is sleep deprivation. Or the air down here. Something toxic. But even as he spoke, he found himself moving toward the stairs, toward the light below, toward whatever remnant of Viorica awaited him. The staircase spiraled downward, each step taking Eli further from the world he understood. The air grew colder, carrying a faint scent of ozone and something else like copper pennies on the tongue. Blood. Shadow remained at the top of the stairs, unwilling to descend. The dog's eyes reflected the dim light, 2 golden orbs watching Eli disappear into the depths. Some guide you are, Eli muttered, but continued alone. The lower level was smaller than those above, a series of interconnected chambers that appeared more hastily constructed, as if added after the original facility was built. Emergency lights cast everything in a sickly amber glow. Unlike the clinical sterility of the upper levels, These rooms had a desperate quality to them. The walls covered in handwritten equations and diagrams scrawled directly onto concrete. The first chamber housed what appeared to be a private office. A metal desk, filing cabinets, and bookshelves filled with worn volumes on neurology, psychology, and quantum mechanics. Dr. Brewer's workspace, Eli guessed. Unlike the other rooms he'd explored, this one showed signs of being deliberately preserved. Sealed filing cabinets, documents in protective sleeves, a dehumidifier that had long since stopped working, but had done its job for decades. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, and beside it a yellowed envelope addressed simply, "To whomever opens this." Eli's hand hovered over the letter. His journalist instinct screamed that this was the story, the confession, the explanation, the truth he'd been seeking. But another part of him, growing stronger with each hour in the bunker, whispered warnings. He opened the journal first. Dr. Brewer's handwriting was meticulous in the early entries, growing increasingly erratic in later pages. Eli flipped through, catching fragments. Subject VI continues to exceed all parameters. Her ability to compartmentalize consciousness allows her to maintain sense of self while projecting influence outward. Breakthrough today. VI successfully implanted a subtle suggestion in Observer 4 without his awareness. When questioned later, he insisted the idea was his own. First concrete evidence of remote influence capability. Ethical concerns mounting. S dismisses them as weakness. These children, what are we creating? What have I enabled? The final entries were the most disturbing. VI is developing beyond our models. No longer requires the amplification chamber to project influence. Range increasing weekly. S is ecstatic. I am terrified. God help me. I believe she's been influencing S all along. Subtle pushes toward more extreme protocols, always presenting them as his own insights. When I confronted him, he became enraged, not like himself at all, like a puppet whose strings were pulled too hard. Final entry. I've sealed what I can. Removed what might be used to replicate our work. V is no longer a victim of this project, but its culmination, a prototype that exceeds its design parameters. I've tried to help the others. For Anka, memory erasure was the only mercy I could offer. For V, there's no undoing what's been done. May whoever finds this understand the burden I'm placing on them. Eli's hands trembled as he set down the journal. A dull ache pulsed behind his eyes, the beginning of a headache that felt like something pressing against his skull from the inside. He reached for the sealed letter, tearing it open with unsteady fingers. The letter was brief. The handwriting hurried. To whomever finds this facility. If you are reading this, a critical threshold has been crossed. The bunker's discovery reactivates latent systems that should remain dormant. This facility was not merely abandoned, it was contained, buried, forgotten by design. Project Yugra created something we could not control. Subject VI, Viorica Yanku, developed capabilities beyond our understanding, influence without apparatus, suggestion across impossible distances, perhaps even across time. The fact that you have found this place suggests her influence may still be operating. Ask yourself, what series of choices led you here? What compulsion drove you to open each door, play each tape? Was it curiosity alone, or something guiding your hand? I failed to stop this project before it went too far. I failed to protect the children in my care. Do not repeat my failure by unleashing what remains. Seal this place. Walk away. Never. Speak of what you found. If you begin experiencing symptoms, nosebleeds, lost time, dreams that feel like memories, you are already being influenced, in which case, God help you. Dr. Isaac Brewer, Final Project Director, Yugra Containment. Protocol until I let the letter fall to the desk. His reflection in a darkened computer monitor showed a thin line of blood trickling from his nostril. He wiped it away, leaving a crimson smear on the back of his hand. No, he whispered. This isn't happening. But even as he denied it, memories surfaced, Moments since entering the bunker that didn't quite connect. How long had he been underground? Hours? Days? His watch showed 4:17 a.m. But which day? The sequence of rooms he'd explored became jumbled in his mind, events rearranging themselves like shuffled cards. And Viorica's voice, he could hear it even now without any tape playing. A whisper at the edge of perception, like someone leaning close to his ear. You came because I called. Because I've always been calling. Eli stumbled from the office, desperate for fresh air, for sunlight, for anything that felt real and solid. The corridor outside seemed to stretch and contract in his vision. On the wall, a child's drawing appeared, not faded with age but vivid, as if freshly created. A stick-figure man with a backpack, a dog leading him forward, a girl waiting below. You're like me, Eli Wade. You tried to bury yourself after Seattle, after what your story did to those people. To Marcus. Stop it, Eli hissed, pressing his palms against his temples. You're not real. You're a recording, an experiment that ended decades ago. Laughter echoed through the corridor, a young girl's laughter that aged as it traveled, becoming a woman's voice. Nothing ends here. It only changes form. Something moved at the edge of his vision. A teenage girl with dark hair watching him from a doorway. When he turned, she was gone. Anka? Or another projection? Eli found himself drawn to a room at the end of the corridor. Inside was another monitoring station, but unlike the others, this one showed signs of recent use. The dust had been disturbed, equipment positions shifted. On a central console, a red light blinked steadily. A recording in progress. He approached it cautiously, noting a microphone hanging above the console. Testing a theory, he spoke. Who are you really? What do you want from me? The speakers crackled. A woman's voice responded, no longer a child, but an adult with the same measured cadence. I am what remains of Viorica Iancu, what they created, what escaped them. I want what I've always wanted, to be found, to be witnessed, to be understood. You led me here, the dog. Shadow finds those who can help, those whose minds are compatible. You've spent years hiding from what you uncovered in Seattle, from the power of revelation. I need someone who understands that power. A sharp pain lanced through Eli's head. He gasped, clutching the console, for support as blood dripped from his nose onto the control panel. Don't fight it, Eli. The headaches worsen when you resist. Another figure flickered in his peripheral vision, closer this time. A woman in her 20s, watching him with dark, familiar eyes. When he turned, she retreated through a doorway he hadn't noticed before. Without thinking, he followed. The doorway led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness. No emergency lights illuminated this passage, only the beam of Eli's flashlight, growing weaker as the batteries failed. From above, he heard Shadow's distant barking, a warning he no longer heeded. Come deeper, the woman's voice urged, no longer through speakers but directly in his mind. See where it began, where Subject 1 waited. As Eli took his first step downward, the lights throughout the facility surged, then died completely. Darkness swallowed him whole, broken only by the feeble glow of his dying flashlight. In that moment of transition between light and dark, he thought he saw her clearly. Not a child or a teenager, but a woman in her 50s, watching him with eyes that held decades of isolation. Now we can talk properly, she said, her voice stronger now. Face to face. Eli descended into absolute darkness, one hand against the cold wall for guidance. His failing flashlight offered only intermittent flickers of illumination, enough to prevent a fall, but little more. The air grew increasingly dense, carrying that same metallic scent but stronger now, almost overpowering. I know you're here, he called into the darkness. I know you're real. No response came, but the oppressive silence seemed to acknowledge his words, as if the facility itself was listening. After what felt like an eternity of careful steps downward, the staircase leveled out. Eli's flashlight gave one final, desperate surge of brightness, revealing a massive chamber that stole his breath away. Unlike the clinical utilitarian spaces above, this room was a cathedral of Cold War science fiction made real. A cavernous dome at least 50 feet across, its ceiling lost in darkness. At the center stood what could only be the psychic amplification chamber, a retrofitted MRI-like device surrounded by banks of analog computers, oscilloscopes, and equipment Eli couldn't begin to identify. Cables thick as his arm snaked across the floor, connecting to transformers and power distribution panels along the walls. His flashlight died completely, plunging him back into darkness. "Shit," he muttered, fumbling in his pack for spare batteries. Before he could find them, soft blue lights activated along the floor's perimeter, followed by the gentle hum of auxiliary power systems coming online. Emergency lighting cast the chamber in an eerie azure glow, transforming it into an underwater grotto of technology and madness. Eli approached the central apparatus with reverent dread. This was where it had happened, where children were transformed into psychic weapons, where Viorica had become something beyond human understanding. The amplification chamber resembled a sensory deprivation tank merged with medical imaging equipment, retrofitted with crude-looking attachments that Eli suspected were early prototype neural interfaces. A child-sized berth lay open at its center, surrounded by monitoring equipment. Though decades old, the machine hummed with residual energy as if merely sleeping rather than abandoned. Along the circular walls, Eli found something that turned his blood cold. Hundreds of childlike drawings etched directly into the concrete. Not with paint or crayon, but scratched with fingernails or perhaps a sharp implement. The earliest ones, near the entrance, were simple stick figures: a girl, a house, a family. As they progressed around the room, they grew increasingly abstract and disturbing. Geometric patterns giving way to fractured faces, stick figures with too many limbs, symbols resembling mathematical equations but subtly wrong, as if invented by a mind that no longer processed reality the way others did. Finally, near the far wall, elaborate mandalas and lattice-like structures that seemed to pulse in the blue light, creating the optical illusion of depth where none existed. "Vi's mind," Eli whispered, tracing one of the patterns with his finger, breaking down and rebuilding itself into something else. At the far end of the chamber stood a simple desk with a reel-to-reel player and a single tape labeled Final Record VI. With trembling hands, Eli threaded the tape and pressed play. The voice that emerged was no longer a child's. A woman spoke, middle-aged perhaps, her accent still present but refined. "This recording is specifically for Eli Wade when he arrives." Eli's breath caught in his throat. "By now you've seen enough to understand what happened here. What they made me into. What I became after they lost control." The woman, Viorica, paused and Eli could hear papers shuffling. "I've watched your career with interest, Eli. Your expose in Seattle, the way you uncovered corruption at the highest levels, heedless of the consequences. The way you've been running from those consequences ever since." She knew him. Somehow, impossibly, she knew his life story. "I need someone who understands both the power of truth and its cost. Someone who has felt the weight of revelation crushing those who weren't prepared for it. Someone who will make the right choice when the moment comes." Another pause. Longer. This time. "I survived, Eli. When they shut down the project in 1987, I was the only subject still alive. Solinari wanted to terminate me too, but Brewer couldn't do it. Instead, he faked my death and helped me escape. I've spent decades learning to control what they created, to contain it, to direct it, to use it only when necessary." Eli noticed a monitoring station near the desk. Its screens flickered to life, showing surveillance footage of the bunker's entrance, the same hatch he'd discovered days ago. The timestamp on the footage read 17 days ago. A hooded figure approached the entrance, punched a series of numbers into a hidden keypad Eli hadn't even noticed, and descended into the facility. "Yes, I returned recently. Viorica's voice continued as if anticipating his question. To prepare for your arrival, to activate dormant systems, to ensure you would find what you needed. The screens changed, showing footage of other parts of the facility, the records room, the observation core, Brewer's office. Each room showed the same hooded figure methodically arranging documents, positioning tapes, restoring minimal power to key systems. I've spent my life tracking others like me, failed experiments from other black sites, children weaponized and then abandoned when the Cold War ended. Some are still out there, Eli, still influencing, still damaged, still dangerous. The final screen showed the forest outside the bunker. Shadow sat beside the entrance, waiting patiently. My time is ending. The cost of what they did to me is finally coming due. But before I go, there's one more thing that needs to be done. One more truth that needs a witness. Or perhaps a keeper. The tape clicked off. In the silence that followed, Eli became aware of soft footsteps behind him. He turned slowly, both dreading and anticipating what he would see, but the chamber appeared empty, just shadows playing across the unsettling wall etchings. A control panel near the amplification chamber suddenly illuminated, its lights blinking in a deliberate sequence. Drawn toward it, Eli found a computer, terminal booting up, an ancient model with a monochrome green display yet somehow still functional. Text appeared on the screen. Subject 1 record accessed. Containment protocol. Active. Broadcast capability. Nominal. Awaiting final authorization. Beneath the text, a command prompt blinked expectantly. Eli stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it all. Subject 1. Not Viorica? There had been someone before her? The implications swirled in his mind, connecting threads that had been deliberately separated in the facility's records. A shadow moved across the wall to his right, elongated, misshapen, too tall to be human. When he turned, nothing was there. "What do you want from me?" Eli called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The terminal pinged, new text appearing. The truth must be witnessed or buried forever. Choice remains with the finder. As if in response to the message, Eli noticed something he'd overlooked. A trail of fresh footprints in the dust leading away from the amplification chamber toward a narrow tunnel at the far side of the room. Too small for the original facility's purpose, it appeared to have been carved later, perhaps as an emergency exit or a secret passage. From above, through layers of concrete and earth, Eli heard Shadow's distant barking, urgent, alarmed, but growing fainter as if the dog were moving away from the facility. The footprints led into the tunnel. Recent footprints. Someone had been here, was perhaps still here, and had left through this passage. Eli glanced back at the terminal, at the amplification chamber, at the disturbing etchings that chronicled Viorica's transformation. The journalist who'd arrived in Romania seeking nothing but solitude now confronted a choice that felt strangely familiar. Pursue the story regardless of consequences or walk away. But this wasn't just any story. This was a legacy of suffering and power that had somehow reached across decades specifically for him. With one last look at the heart of the machine that had created Viorica, Eli stepped into the tunnel, following the footprints toward whatever waited beyond. The tunnel was narrow but surprisingly well maintained. Not a relic of the original facility, but something carved more recently. Eli had to crouch as he followed the footprints, his headlamp casting jumping shadows ahead. The air grew marginally fresher as he progressed, carrying hints of pine and damp earth. After what felt like a quarter mile, the passage began to slope upward. Wooden supports replaced concrete, and eventually, Eli found himself facing a crude ladder leading to a trapdoor. He pushed it open cautiously, emerging into what appeared to be a tool shed. Rusty gardening implements hung on the walls, and a workbench covered in dust stood beneath a small, grimy window. Eli climbed out, muscles aching from the hunched journey through the tunnel. A door led outside, and through its warped frame, he could see forest, the same dense Carpathian woodland but in early morning light. How long had he been underground? He'd lost all sense of time. Beyond the shed stood a small, weather-beaten cabin. Smoke curled from its chimney, dissipating into the misty air. The footprints continued from the shed to the cabin's door. As Eli approached, Shadow appeared from the trees, trotting to his side. The dog seemed different somehow, more alert, but less tense, as if whatever mission had compelled it to lead Eli to the bunker was now complete. The cabin door was unlocked. Eli hesitated only briefly before pushing it open. "Hello?" he called softly. No answer came, but the interior showed signs of recent habitation. A single room with sparse furnishings, a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and shelves lined with books and notebooks. A kerosene lamp burned low on the table. But it was what covered the walls that stopped Eli cold. Photographs, dozens of them. Some showed the bunker in various stages of excavation and sealing. Others documented what appeared to be similar facilities across Eastern Europe. And among them, images of Eli himself, walking through Seattle, sitting in a cafe in Berlin, hiking in the Austrian Alps. Years of surveillance, cataloged with clinical precision. "She's been watching me," he whispered, moving closer to examine a photo dated just 6 months earlier. "For how long?" On the table lay an open journal, its pages filled with the same handwriting he'd heard on the tapes, no longer a child's script but a mature, educated hand. He skimmed the most recent entry. April 17th, 2023. The American arrives. Tomorrow. Preparations complete. Shadow will find him. The connection is already established. The facility has been prepared to reveal exactly what's needed, no more. Some truths must be measured carefully, administered like medicine, not unleashed like poison. What remains of Subject 1 grows restless. The containment protocols weaken yearly. One way or another, this ends now, with exposure or with final burial. Eli Wade must decide which. I've arranged both possibilities. If I'm wrong about him... The entry ended there, unfinished. Eli turned to a small desk in the corner, where stacks of files bore official NATO and Romanian intelligence seals, clearly stolen from the bunker over years, perhaps decades. He rifled through them quickly, finding evidence of systematic removal of Project Ugra from official records. Brewer's research had been buried, the facility erased from maps, the surviving children redistributed with new identities. A complete cover-up orchestrated at the highest levels. A sudden knock at the door made Eli jump. Shadow growled low, moving to position himself between Eli and the entrance. The knock came again, more insistent. Eli glanced around for a weapon, finding nothing better than a poker from the wood stove. He gripped it tightly and approached the door. "Who's there?" he called. A woman's voice answered, accented but clear. "I know you're inside, Mr. Wade. I know my sister brought you here. Please, we need to talk before it's too late." "Sister?" Eli opened the door cautiously, poker still raised. On the threshold stood a woman in her 50s, her dark hair streaked with gray, but her eyes unmistakably like those he'd seen in the bunker's photographs. Not Viorica, but Anka, he breathed. She nodded grimly. "May I come in? We don't have much time." Eli stepped aside, lowering the poker but not setting it down. Anka entered, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make herself unnoticeable. Shadow relaxed visibly at her presence, his tail giving a single wag of recognition. "You know the dog," Eli observed. "Shadow has been with us a long time," she replied. "He was part of the program too. Animals were easier to condition than children, more reliable, less likely to develop complications." Anka moved to the stove, adding a log to the fire with practiced efficiency. "You've been in the bunker. You've seen what they did there." "I saw footage of you," Eli said. "They said you were terminated." A bitter smile crossed her face. "Memory death is a kind of termination, Mr. Wade. Dr. Brewer erased everything. Who I was, my connection to Viorica, what I'd seen at the facility, gave me a new identity, new memories, a new life in Hungary. She tapped her temple. But the mind is resilient. Fragments returned over decades, enough to piece together the truth, enough to find my way back. The record said you tried to rescue her. I did. Anka's voice grew heavy with old grief. Our parents died when the Ceausescu regime was collapsing. We were placed in an orphanage. When they took Viorica for the program, I spent years searching for her. When I finally found her and tried to get her out, it was already too late. Too late how? Eli asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Anka met his gaze directly. The girl you heard on those tapes doesn't exist anymore, Mr. Wade. What remains is something else. Something shaped by isolation, experimentation, and trauma. Something that learned to fragment its own consciousness as a survival mechanism. She moved to the wall of photographs, touching one that showed the bunker's entrance, being sealed with concrete in what appeared to be the late 1980s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO wanted all evidence of Project Ugra buried. The children who survived were too damaged to be rehabilitated, too dangerous to be released. Most were terminated humanely, but Viorica was special, the only true success. Brewer couldn't bring himself to kill her, so he helped fake her death and smuggled her out. Where is she now? Eli asked. Anka's expression darkened. Everywhere and nowhere, the amplification chamber did something to her, opened pathways in her mind that never closed. She can project herself, influence thoughts across vast distances. What you experienced in the bunker, the voice guiding you, the impossible foreknowledge. That was really her? Eli whispered, the implication sending a chill through him. Parts of her, Anka corrected. Fragments she's learned to distribute like seeds. She's been watching you for years, Mr. Wade, preparing you, leading you here. Why me? Why now? Anka moved to the window, scanning the forest with practiced wariness. Because she's dying. The human brain wasn't meant to sustain what they did to her. The fragmenting consciousness, the remote viewing, the influence capabilities. They're tearing her mind apart. She needs someone to continue her work. What? Work? Eli demanded. Before Anka could answer, a sharp pain lanced through Eli's head. He gasped, clutching the table for support. A voice, Viorica's voice, whispered directly into his mind. Come back. Finish what we started. She's contacting you, Anka said. Not a question, but a recognition. I can see it in your face. Eli nodded, unable to speak as the pressure in his head intensified. Don't listen to her, Viorica's voice continued. She wants to bury the truth. I want to expose it. She's lying, Anka said urgently, stepping closer. What she wants is to transfer everything, her knowledge, her trauma, her power to you. The terminal in the bunker is still active. That's why she led you there. One more session in the amplification chamber with a compatible mind. Yours. And her consciousness can transfer before her body fails. The pressure in Eli's head subsided slightly. He straightened, looking between the photographs of himself and the desperate woman before him. How do I know you're telling the truth? He asked Anka. How do I know this isn't another manipulation? You don't, she admitted. That's the curse of Project Ugra. Once you know it exists, nothing is certain anymore. But ask yourself, why would someone who wants to expose the truth operate in shadows for decades? Why not go public years ago? The question struck home. Eli had been a journalist. Exposing truths was what he did, or what he used to do before Seattle, before Marcus. She doesn't understand, Viorica whispered in his mind. Some truths can only be preserved, not broadcast. Some revelations require preparation. Eli closed his eyes, trying to sort through the competing voices. Viorica's in his mind, Anka's in his ears, and his own journalist's instinct somewhere beneath it all. When he opened them again, his decision was made. I'm going back, he told Anka. Fear flashed across her face. Please don't. Whatever she's shown you, whatever she's promised, I need to see for myself, Eli interrupted. I need to finish this story, one way or another. He moved toward the door, shadow rising, to follow him. Anka made no move to stop him physically, but her final words followed him into the misty morning. The truth doesn't always set us free, Mr. Wade. Sometimes it just creates new prisons. The return journey to the bunker felt different, purposeful, inevitable. Eli no longer stumbled through darkness but moved with the certainty of someone following a path they'd always been meant to walk. Shadow led the way, navigating the forest with fluid ease, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure Eli hadn't changed his mind. Anka's warnings echoed in his thoughts, competing with Viorica's gentle but persistent call. Two sisters, separated by fate and reconnected by his presence. Both claimed to want protection, one for Eli, one for the truth. Both could be lying. The bunker entrance stood open just as he'd left it, the metal hatch reflecting dull morning light. As Eli descended the now familiar ladder, he noticed subtle changes throughout the facility. Lights that had been dead now glowed with steady purpose. Doors that had been sealed stood open. The entire complex seemed to have awakened during his absence, as if anticipating his return. He made his way directly to the heart of the complex, the massive chamber housing the amplification apparatus. But when he reached it, he found the room transformed. The machine at its center had been activated, its components humming with energy. Banks of equipment along the walls now displayed scrolling, data, lights blinking in hypnotic patterns, and surrounding the central platform, a ring of what appeared to be transmission equipment had been assembled. Modern components grafted onto Cold War technology with ingenious precision. A broadcast array. "You came back." The voice, familiar, from the tapes but now alive and present, came from behind him. Eli turned slowly. A woman stood in the shadows near the entrance. Tall, thin, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back severely from a face that carried echoes of the serious child from the photographs. Her eyes were the same, penetrating, unnervingly focused, but now set in a face lined with decades of isolation and purpose. Viorica Yanku. No longer a voice on tape, but flesh and blood. "You're really here," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Parts of me," she replied with a small, sad smile. "Enough to finish what needs to be done." She stepped forward, moving with careful precision, like someone conserving limited energy. Up close, Eli could see the toll the years had taken, her body frail, her hands trembling slightly. But her eyes remained sharp, alert, fully present. "Did you speak with my sister?" she asked. Eli nodded. "She thinks you want to transfer your consciousness to me, that you're dying." "She's right about the dying part." Viorica moved toward the central platform, running her fingers along the machinery with something like affection. "What they did to me, the human mind wasn't designed to fragment and reintegrate repeatedly. The cost accumulates. I've held on long enough to find the right person, you." "Why me?" "Because you understand the burden of revelation," she said simply. "Your Seattle story exposed corruption at the highest levels of government and finance. Lives were ruined, people died, including your friend Marcus. The name hit Eli like a physical blow. How could you possibly know about him?" "I told you I can reach across distances, see fragments of lives. When I found you 3 years ago drowning your guilt in meaningless wandering, I recognized a kindred spirit, someone who had unleashed a truth and wasn't prepared for its consequences." She gestured to the broadcast array. "This is what remains of Project Ugra. Not just the experiments themselves, but the infrastructure created to contain the knowledge of what was done. NATO, the Americans, the post-Soviet authorities, all conspired to bury not just this facility, but dozens like it across the former Eastern Bloc." Viorica activated a control panel. Screens around the room illuminated with images of similar bunkers, similar equipment, similar children. Ugra was just one code name. There were others, programs designed to weaponize consciousness itself. Most failed. None produced results like me. Her voice carried no pride, only a weary acknowledgement of fact. When the Cold War ended, both sides buried their mistakes. The researchers were reassigned, records destroyed, successful subjects either terminated or repurposed. Repurposed how? Eli asked, dreading the answer. Some were absorbed into intelligence agencies. Others became private assets for powerful individuals. A few like me escaped, or were allowed to escape when men like Brewer couldn't stomach what they'd created. She turned to face him directly. Now you have a choice, Eli Wade. The broadcast array is functional. It can transmit everything. The tapes, the records, the evidence, to intelligence agencies, news outlets, and digital repositories worldwide. One switch, and decades of buried history becomes impossible to deny. Shadow entered the chamber, moving to sit equidistant between them, watching with unnervingly human alertness. Or, Eli prompted, or you help me ensure it remains buried forever. Viorica's voice softened. Not out of cowardice or complicity, but out of wisdom. Some weapons should never be rediscovered, some methods never replicated. And what happens to you? I've made my arrangements. What remains of my consciousness will fragment one final time, then dissipate. No transfer, no continuation, just completion. Eli studied her face, searching for deception and finding only exhaustion. How do I know you're telling the truth? That this isn't manipulation? You don't, she answered, echoing her sister's words. That's the final test of the bunker. It was designed not just to create subjects like me, but to examine what happens when the truth is discovered. Does the finder expose, exploit, or bury? Each choice reveals something essential about human nature. The implications staggered Eli. The bunker itself is an experiment, even now. Everything is, Mr. Wade. Viorica's smile was gentle but sad. Even your presence here was anticipated, if not specifically by Solinari and Brewer, then by the architecture of what they created. A facility designed to be forgotten yet discoverable, records meant to be buried yet preserved. She gestured to the broadcast controls. The choice remains yours. Eli approached the console slowly. Buttons and switches labeled in Cyrillic and English offered a simple binary: transmit or purge. The journalist who had arrived in Romania seeking solitude now stood at the culmination of a path that had perhaps been waiting for him all along. The story before him was bigger than anything he'd ever uncovered. Evidence of unethical experimentation, government cover-ups, living weapons created from orphaned children. The kind of truth that changes history. The kind that ruins lives. In Seattle, he said quietly, I published because I believed the truth was absolute. That exposure always served justice. And now? Viorica asked. Now I know truth is a blade that cuts both ways. Sometimes exposing secrets causes more damage than keeping them. Shadow whined softly, ears pricked forward as if listening to something beyond human perception. She's here, isn't she? Eli asked. Anka followed me. Viorica nodded. My sister never stopped trying to save me, even when she couldn't remember who I was. As if summoned by her name, Anka appeared at the chamber entrance, breathless from having followed Eli's path. Her eyes locked with her sister's, perhaps their first direct contact in decades. Vi, she whispered, the diminutive revealing a bond that had survived memory wipes and years of separation. It's all right, Viorica said, her composure cracking for the first time. He understands. Eli looked between the sisters, then down at Shadow, who had risen and now stood alert, waiting. The choice before him was no longer abstract, publish, or withhold, but viscerally human. 3 lives converging on a moment of decision with history and future hanging in the balance. His hand hovered over the console. Some truths demand to be told, he said softly. Others. His fingers closed on the switch. Later, as dusk settled over the Carpathian forest, a lone figure emerged from the earth. Eli Wade stood in the clearing, watching as Shadow trotted toward the trees, paused once to look back, then disappeared into the gathering darkness. Behind him, the bunker entrance was now sealed, not with rusted metal but with fresh concrete. No future wanderer would stumble upon its secrets by accident. In his pack, a single journal contained the story he would never publish. The story only he would know completely. As Eli turned toward the path that would lead him back to civilization, he reached into his pocket, feeling the small metal object Viorica had pressed into his hand during those final moments below. A key. Not to the bunker, but to something else. Something still waiting to be discovered, or perhaps to remain hidden. Shadow's howl echoed through the forest. Once, twice, then silence. The sound of a sentinel released from duty. Or maybe, a guide calling toward the next journey. Eli smiled faintly and began walking. The truth had not set him free, but neither had it destroyed him. And in that balance, perhaps, lay wisdom. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.